"You can throw me out later," Angelico muttered. "But if you want her to live, you'll let me near her now." The man's voice was deep, unwavering. Angelico James, suited in black like he was attending a funeral he refused to accept, marched past the hospital guards before anyone could stop him. His hands were bare, but in his jacket pocket was something older than any drug in that room, something bitter, something sacred. "Sir, you're not authorized." "That's his daughter." Angelico jabbed a finger toward the glass-walled ICU, where a 10-year-old Ruth Berry lay limp beneath a tangle of tubes. "And I made a promise to her mother before she died. You want to stand in the way of that?" The guard hesitated. Just long enough. Inside, chaos whispered through machines. Monitors beeped in erratic pulses. A nurse called out vitals that made no sense. "We've tried everything," a specialist muttered, sweat dripping down his temple. Around the bed stood 13 of the best doctors in the world, flown in from Tokyo, Zurich, Boston, and Tel Aviv, every one of them baffled. John Berry, billionaire tech founder and father of the dying girl, stood like a man broken open. "You said you could fix this," he growled. "Why is she getting worse?" No one answered. Then Angelico stepped into the room. No badge, no stethoscope, just fire in his eyes and something ancient in his hands. "I buried a niece like her. Same eyes, same scream, same silence." He didn't wait for permission. He reached for Ruth's wrist, whispering something in Italian, uncorked the bitter vial, and tipped it against her tongue. "If this works," he said without looking up, "you'll hate me for what it reveals." Before we begin, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. Angelico James hadn't always believed in ghosts, but there were moments, quiet, unbearable ones, where he felt her near. His niece, Sofia, had been gone 10 years, and still, her laugh crept through his memory like a warm breeze slicing through cold stone. She'd been 11, bright-eyed, sharp-tongued, too clever for a world that didn't know how to protect her. The day she collapsed was a spring Sunday in Queens. She'd just come back from soccer practice, complaining that her legs felt heavy. His sister, Livia, thought it was the flu. Angelico had been visiting that afternoon, bringing pastries from Little Italy like he always did. By evening, Sofia was vomiting, shaking, and whispering that her bones were burning. The hospital said it was a seizure, but Angelico remembered the look on Sofia's face when the first one hit. Not just confusion, but terror, like she knew something inside her was wrong. The doctors ran tests. Blood work, scans, everything a good insurance plan could buy. They found nothing. What they did find, weeks later, was a subtle swelling around her brainstem. Idiopathic inflammation, they called it, which was a fancy way of saying, "We don't know why this is happening." She lasted another month. In and out of comas, sometimes lucid, sometimes begging them to turn off the lights because the flickering made the world spin. Angelico stayed by her side most nights. He held her hand during the fits, pressed cool cloths to her forehead, listened to her whispers when her voice could still form words. "Uncle Jello," she said one night, her eyes glassy. "Something's wrong. Not with me, with them." He'd asked what she meant, but she couldn't finish. The seizure that followed stole her voice for good. When she died, the hospital called it a, quote, "rare neurological event." The autopsy was sealed faster than he expected. Angelico wasn't a doctor, but even he knew something didn't add up. Livia, broken and sleepwalking through grief, couldn't fight. So Angelico did. He pushed for answers, filed inquiries, pressured the hospital board. But every request was denied, blocked, or delayed into meaninglessness. Laxonics Laboratories, the pharmaceutical company listed on several of Sofia's medications, issued a statement saying the treatments were within experimental bounds under compassionate use. That phrase stuck with him. Experimental bounds. What did that mean? How had his niece become a testing ground without consent? Angelico had contacts in dark corners, federal clerks who owed him favors, pharma reps with gambling debts, even a retired FDA official who'd once taken his money in exchange for a passport fix. Piece by piece, he dug. It took months, then years. The deeper he went, the quieter the trail became. Laxonics, it turned out, had ties to dozens of clinics in low-income districts, places where oversight was minimal, and the families were desperate. He uncovered patterns. Children between ages 9 and 13, admitted for minor infections or asthma, suddenly developing neurological symptoms after treatment. All of them had been given early-stage immune modulators, some of which hadn't even cleared animal testing. And the kicker? None of their deaths were publicly reported. The records were buried, hidden under medical jargon and corporate red tape. Angelico kept files. He wrote names in a red leather notebook Sofia had once used for her math homework. Every time he added a name, he paused, whispered it aloud, and promised he wouldn't stop. No more ghosts, he told himself. Not if I can help it. One of the worst discoveries came 3 years later. A boy named Darius in Detroit, just 12, died within days of starting a trial for a new allergy treatment. His family hadn't signed a trial agreement. They didn't even know he was part of one. Angelico drove 9 hours to speak to Darius's mother. She cried when he showed her Sofia's photo. "They used my baby like a lab rat," she said. "They didn't even tell me." Angelico didn't cry. He hadn't cried since Sofia, but he burned. Inside his chest, a fire that never cooled. He started circling names of executives. Laxonics board members, hospital administrators, researchers with too many NDAs on their resumes. He wasn't subtle. And that's when the threat started. Anonymous calls, surveillance vans outside his club in Midtown. A message carved into the hood of his car. "Stay out of what you don't understand." But Angelico was born into blood and survival. The people threatening him had never knelt beside a dying child. Still, even he knew he couldn't take them on without proof that meant something outside street justice. He needed a whistleblower, a file leak, something explosive. For a while, he thought it might never come. Then, one Friday morning, it did. His burner phone rang, the one only a few people had. A voice, distorted but clear. "The symptoms are back. Different city, different girl, same drug signature." Angelico's throat tightened. "Where?" he asked. The voice answered. "Grace Memorial Hospital, Upper East Side. The girl's name is Ruth Berry." Angelico froze. That name, Berry. He knew it well. John Berry had once sat across from him in a boardroom lined with glass and lawyers. They'd been on opposite sides of a surveillance tech merger that went up in flames. John had outmaneuvered him legally. Angelico had retaliated by leaking dirt that cost Berry 2 board seats and almost tanked his IPO. But that wasn't all. Years before, when John's wife was still alive, Angelico had done her a favor. Something small, unspoken, silencing a scandal that would have made national headlines. She had whispered a thank you through tears. And later, she'd written Angelico a letter, one he still kept, sealed, in a drawer with Sofia's notebook. "If anything ever happens to me," it said, "or to Ruth, and John doesn't know what to do, promise me you'll help. I know what kind of man you are, Angelico. You see what others miss." He opened that letter again after the call. His hands didn't shake. His resolve didn't waver. It had taken 10 years, but the moment had come. He packed his bag. Not with weapons. With roots and herbs, crushed minerals, an old Sicilian tincture his grandmother used to treat inflammation the doctors couldn't name. He tucked in the letter. And then he whispered to the ghost in the notebook, "One more, Sofia. We're not done yet." The drive to Grace Memorial was silent. No music. No calls. Just him and the storm that had waited a decade. This time, the child wouldn't die. This time, the poison would speak. The hum of machines was louder than it should have been. Even the air felt sterile, like grief had scrubbed the color out of the room. John Berry sat beside his daughter's hospital bed, unmoving, watching Ruth's chest rise and fall in jagged, unnatural rhythm. Her eyelids didn't flutter. Her fingers hadn't twitched in nearly an hour. 1 week ago, she was chasing the dog through their Hamptons garden, screeching with joy, wild curls bouncing in the sunlight. Now she looked like a wax figure. Pale. Hollow. As if whatever made her Ruth had already packed up and left. Doctors whispered in corners. Nurses moved around like shadows. One screen showed her heart rhythm, another monitored blood pressure. Both with graphs John had memorized by now. None of it gave him answers. Only patterns. Doctor. Samuel Brandt, the chief neurologist from Switzerland, had flown in first class on Berry's private jet. So had specialists from Tokyo and Tel Aviv. Each of them had been paid more in one day than most doctors earned in a year. They brought their titles, their confidence, their foreign accents. And still, Ruth got worse. The words idiopathic onset echoed again and again. Medical language for we don't know what this is. They ran tests around the clock. MRI, court EEG. Whole genome sequencing. Nothing explained the seizures, the comas, the declining organ function. John had approved an experimental steroid, then pulled her off it when she reacted poorly. They tried plasma filtration. Nothing. The consensus shifted from hopeful to resigned. One doctor suggested palliative care, and John nearly fired him on the spot. But fury wasn't helping anymore. Money wasn't helping. Technology wasn't helping. Every time Ruth seized, she took a piece of John with her. And now she wasn't seizing, which was worse, because it meant her body had stopped trying to fight. He leaned forward, brushing a curl from her cheek, whispering so no one else could hear. "You can stop pretending to be brave, Bunny. I know it hurts." His voice cracked. "But don't go yet, please." He couldn't cry. Not in front of them. Not with so many eyes. Nurses, assistants, the world's best minds, waiting to see if John Berry would break. His entire empire had been built on calm, on always knowing the next move. But there was no next move now. Just hope. And he didn't trust that anymore. Not since the funeral. Not since the casket lowered, and Ruth clutched his coat and whispered, "You're all I have now, Daddy." 4 years later, he still felt her grip in his sleeve. Claire had been the glue. She balanced him. Loved Ruth with a softness he'd never learned to imitate. Her cancer came quick. 6 months from diagnosis to goodbye. Ruth was 6. He was rich. None of it mattered. He'd promised Claire 2 things before she died. First, he'd protect Ruth no matter what. Second, he'd make time for life, not just work. He failed at by the second year. And now the first one was unraveling before his eyes. It started small. Ruth had a mild cold last fall. Her immune system seemed sluggish recovering, so her pediatrician, a friend of John's from Yale, recommended an immune optimization supplement from a partner lab. Cutting-edge biotech, he'd said. Laxonics approved. John signed the approval forms himself. It wasn't unusual. He'd invested in Laxonics 2 quarters prior, bought in early before their immune line hit phase 3 trials. He trusted their data, trusted their brand, trusted their clean, white labs and marble-floored conference rooms. The bottle arrived in gold-trimmed packaging. Claire would have hated it. "Looks like a perfume ad, not a prescription," she would have said. Ruth took 1 dose, then another. By the 5th day, she complained her eyes were burning. The rash came next. Then the fevers. Then the nosebleeds. Tiny ones at first. The kind you blame on dry air. But when she fainted in their kitchen, John's stomach flipped in a way he hadn't felt since Claire's scans lit up red. The local hospital transferred her within hours. Since then, it had been a slow descent. John gave the doctors every resource. His jet, his team, his data access. Nothing made a difference. Now she was fading, and the room full of white coats had run out of explanations. Dr. Brandt stepped forward with a grim expression. "Her vitals are weakening again. We may be approaching system shutdown." John barely heard him. He stood slowly, straightening his tie. "What haven't we tried?" he asked, voice brittle. "What's left?" Dr. Brandt didn't answer. No one did. The silence was suffocating. John stared down at his daughter's tiny, fragile frame, his own flesh and blood slipping through his fingers like vapor. The man who once built a billion-dollar predictive algorithm couldn't predict whether his daughter would survive the next 10 minutes. That was the cruelty of it. Knowing everything except how to save the one thing that mattered. He turned toward the window, trying to steady his breath. Then the door buzzed. A nurse entered, looking cautious. "Mr. Berry," she said, voice low. "There's someone downstairs. Says he might know what's happening to your daughter." John didn't turn. "We've had 16 experts this week. Unless he's got God on the line, I don't want to hear it." The nurse hesitated. "He said you'd recognize the name. Angelico James." The room went still. John's head turned slowly. His expression shifted. Confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked like anger wrapped in old dust. "That can't be right." His voice dropped. "Tell me exactly what he said." He said, and I quote, "Tell John Berry I've come to keep a promise, and if he still loves his daughter, he'll let me through the door." What would you do if the only person who could save your child was the one person you hoped you'd never see again? Leave a comment below. Would you trust Angelico James or slam the door shut for good? John Berry didn't move. The nurse's words echoed in his head like a ricochet. Angelico James is downstairs. It felt like a hallucination. Something too absurd to register, like hearing that a ghost had walked through the lobby. For a moment, John thought he might be dreaming. But the look on the nurse's face was real. Pale, unsure, waiting for him to make the call. His first instinct was rage. Pure, red, venomous fury. Angelico James was the last name John wanted to hear. The last man he'd ever imagined being connected to Ruth in any way. The two of them had history. Ugly, volatile, unfinished. He thought he'd buried that chapter years ago, sealed it under legal documents and polite public silence. John exhaled through his nose, jaw clenched. "Where exactly is he?" The nurse glanced down at her notes. "Private security has him in holding outside ICU check-in. He said he wouldn't come further unless you gave the word." John's blood pressure spiked. That sounded like Angelico. Dramatic, calculating, using guilt as leverage. But there was something else, too. Restraint. Angelico wasn't the type to ask. He was the type to take. If he was waiting, that meant something. John stared down at Ruth, motionless beneath her linens. Her skin had taken on a yellow-gray tone that made his stomach twist. The monitors beeped a rhythm that now felt more like a countdown. He didn't have time for theatrics. But he also didn't have answers. He turned sharply. "Keep the machines running. If anything changes, you page me. No one, and I mean no one, makes a decision without my sign-off." The nurse nodded and slipped out. The hallway outside felt colder than before. Every fluorescent light hummed like a warning. As he walked toward ICU check-in, memories surfaced like rot beneath polished floors. Angelico's name hadn't been spoken in this hospital, or any room in John's life, in years. And now, here he was. Security stood in a tight line near the glass doors. Behind them stood the man himself, unchanged somehow. Angelico James looked like a ghost who never learned how to die. Same black suit, same cold eyes, same presence that could silence a room with nothing more than a breath. John stopped 5 feet from the door. "You've got 10 seconds, he said, voice sharp as glass. "Tell me why I shouldn't have security drag you back to whatever alley you crawled out of." Angelico smiled faintly, like he expected that. "Because I didn't come for you. I came for Ruth." He reached into his coat pocket, slowly, deliberately. The guards tensed. He pulled out a small, creased envelope. John didn't reach for it. He didn't move. "What is that?" Angelico held it up between 2 fingers. "A letter. From Claire. Dated 5 years ago." His tone darkened. "You should read it." That name, Claire, landed like a hammer. John felt his stomach tighten, throat close. For a moment, the machines, the walls, the noise, all of it blurred. He stepped forward and snatched the envelope from Angelico's hand. His fingers trembled as he unfolded the page. It was Claire's handwriting. Elegant, looping, ink slightly faded. There was no mistaking it. "If anything ever happens to me, or to Ruth, and I'm not there to make the call, let Angelico help. He sees things you don't. Trust him, just once, if you have to. I know what you think of him, but I also know what he did for me." John closed his eyes. The letter might as well have been a knife. Claire never told him she wrote this. Never said she'd reached out to Angelico. And now, with her gone, this felt like betrayal, or prophecy. "I saved her once," Angelico said quietly. "Back when that senator tried to leak her college records, I made that problem disappear." His voice was steady, but his eyes weren't gloating. "She asked me for a favor. I gave it." John remembered, barely. It had been a scandal buried in whispers, hushed through back channels. He assumed one of his PR teams had handled it. He never asked. Claire hadn't wanted him to. "She made me promise," Angelico said. "If Ruth was ever in danger, and you couldn't fix it, I'd step in." He looked at John without flinching. Well, here we are. John hated him for that. For being right. For carrying a promise made in a hospital waiting room 10 years ago. For still having that damn letter. For showing up now, when John had no other moves left. He stared at the man who'd once threatened to ruin him in court, then pulled him from a scandal no one else even knew was coming. Their relationship had never been normal. Rivals. Rescuers. Enemies with matching scars. This doesn't make us friends, John muttered. No, Angelico replied. But it makes us something. They stood there in silence, two men bound by the same child for entirely different reasons. John looked past him, to the ward doors, the machines, the helplessness. And Claire's words echoed again. Trust him, just once, if you have to. He finally spoke, barely above a whisper. God help me. Let him try. The silence in the ICU was heavy enough to crush air. John watched as Angelico stepped forward, unbuttoning his jacket, eyes scanning the machines like he already knew what they were saying. The doctors clustered near the doorway, whispering objections, but none dared stop him. The nurse closest to Ruth froze, uncertain whether to intervene. Angelico ignored them all. He pulled a small leather pouch from his coat, worn, faded, tied with a frayed string. From it he drew several dark herbs, dried and curled like forgotten leaves. You brought plants? One of the specialists scoffed, incredulous. Angelico didn't even look at him. These saved lives before you learned to read a chart. John's throat tightened. What are you doing? Angelico's hands were steady as he laid out the ingredients on a sterile tray. Something that's older than your machines, he replied. You've tested her blood. You've scanned her brain, but you haven't looked at what's inside her cells, the poison that doesn't show up on your fancy screens. Dr. Brandt took a cautious step forward. You're not a physician, Mr. James. Angelico's expression sharpened. No, but I watched my niece die while a room full of doctors argued about semantics. They waited for a machine to tell them what her body already knew. He began crushing the herbs with the back of a spoon. And by the time they realized what was wrong, it was too late. The smell filled the room. Earthy, sharp, metallic. John flinched as the scent hit him, strange and foreign, yet somehow clean. What is that? He asked quietly. Angelico didn't look up. Wild rosemary, sage, and fiore di sangue. Grows only in southern Sicily. My grandmother taught me to mix it for cleansing the blood. He reached into the pouch again, pulling out a small vial of amber liquid. Boiled in mineral water from the Monte Iblea springs, he said softly. Untouched by pollution. My grandmother used it to draw out metal toxins. He poured a few drops into the crushed mixture and stirred until it turned dark green, almost black. Dr. Brandt moved to protest, but John raised a hand. You've had your chance, he said. Let him do what he came to do. The authority in his tone silenced the room. Angelico gave a single nod of gratitude, quiet, almost reverent. He dipped a clean cloth into the mixture, wringing it until the liquid dripped slowly. Then he touched it to Ruth's lips. What the hell are you? One nurse started, but stopped when Ruth's lips twitched. Angelico's voice dropped to a whisper. Her body knows this. It's remembering how to fight. John stepped closer, unable to breathe. You said your niece had the same thing? Angelico's jaw tightened. Same eyes, same pale skin. Same doctors telling me it was idiopathic. They said it was in her brain. But it wasn't. It was in her blood. He placed 2 fingers gently on Ruth's neck, then her wrists, pressing on points with surgical precision. When the body is poisoned, it fights in silence. The immune system turns on itself, attacking what it can't process. The seizures, the fever, the coma, they're all signs of the body's defense collapsing. His eyes flickered to the monitors. But there's still time. Ruth's heart monitor beeped unevenly. A nurse gasped. The pulse line flickered, once, then again, stronger this time. Her heart rate's rising, someone whispered. Another nurse leaned in. BP's stabilizing, she's responding. The room erupted in movement, alarms adjusting. doctors scrambling to verify the impossible. Angelico didn't move. He kept one hand on her wrist, the other over her chest, murmuring under his breath. "That's it, Piccolina. Keep fighting. Don't let them win." His voice trembled only slightly, the sound of a man haunted by memory and redemption at once. John could barely speak. How is that possible?" Angelico finally looked up. "Because medicine forgot where it came from. My grandmother treated farm workers who inhaled mercury dust from factories. No machines, no labs, just instinct and observation. She said, if the body can still heat, it can still heal." Dr. Brandt stared at the monitor in disbelief. "Her neurological readings are stabilizing. This shouldn't be possible." Angelico shrugged. "Neither should a man burying a child for the same mistake twice." He turned to John. "Sofia had the same symptoms, the same pattern, and the same corporate name printed on the bottle by her bed." John's stomach dropped. "Laxonics." The name came out like a confession. Angelico nodded slowly. "Your company's partner," he said quietly. "I've seen it before. Children in Detroit, New Orleans, Palermo, same story. All poisoned by something they never should have touched." He dipped another cloth, wringing it gently, wiping Ruth's forehead. "Doctors call it an immune disorder. They're half right. It's a toxin the body can't filter, disguised as medicine." He looked around at the doctors. "And you're all treating the symptoms, not the cause." No one spoke. The tension in the room was electric. Even Dr. Brandt, the skeptic, seemed rooted to the floor, staring at the steady pulse line like it was divine intervention. The silence broke only when the monitor beeped in perfect rhythm. Ruth's heartbeat, consistent and strong. John's knees nearly buckled. He pressed a hand to his mouth, eyes blurring with tears he didn't remember forming. "She's breathing easier," one nurse said softly. "Pulse stable. Oxygen climbing." The words came out like a miracle disguised as data. Angelico stepped back, exhaling slowly. His hands shook now that it was over. "It's working," he murmured. "The herbs will help her liver and kidneys purge the metals. The rest will depend on time, and on whether you stop feeding her poison." John looked at him sharply. "Poison?" Angelico turned, eyes cold. "The drug she was given. It's contaminated, like Sofia's was. You're not dealing with genetics or neurology. You're dealing with greed." Dr. Brandt's voice cracked. "You're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting," Angelico interrupted. "I'm telling you, this isn't a seizure disorder. It's slow poisoning," he pointed toward Ruth's IV. "And you're looking in the wrong place." The doctors froze. John's mind raced, the weight of guilt already clawing at his chest. He had authorized the supplement himself, the miracle cure, the immune booster, backed by his company's partner. He'd signed it, approved it, given it to his daughter without question. And now that decision sat before him, unconscious and fragile, fighting for life. Angelico turned to leave the bedside, his voice low but steady. "You want to save her? Start by finding out what's in what you gave her. The blood doesn't lie." He glanced at Ruth one last time. "Neither do the dead." The room stayed silent long after he stopped speaking. The monitors beeped softly, almost steady, like Ruth was holding on, between worlds, between science and faith. John stared at the man he once called an enemy and saw something terrifyingly clear. He wasn't guessing. He was remembering. If you were John, would you believe a man like Angelico, or trust the doctors who'd failed you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in that room? The ICU had quieted, but John Barry's mind hadn't. Ruth's vitals were stable now, more stable than they'd been in days, and that should have brought him peace. Instead, all he could feel was dread slithering up his spine. Angelico's words echoed in his ears like a curse. "This isn't a seizure. It's poisoning." And if that was true, John hadn't just failed his daughter, he'd been the one to pull the trigger. He sat in the hospital's private conference room, staring at the glass table like it could rewrite the last 3 weeks. Angelico stood by the window, silent, arms crossed, watching traffic move below like he was timing the fall of empires. Dr. Brandt paced behind them, nervously flipping through a tablet. "We've requested toxicology," he muttered. Standard blood panels showed nothing, but if what Mr. James says is true, we'll need to expand the scope. Angelico turned. Don't test the blood. It's too late. It's already cleared most of it. Brant frowned. Then where? Hair, fat tissue, skin cells, Angelico interrupted. That's where the truth lives. Metals bind. They hide, but they don't disappear. John finally looked up. And you're certain this is what killed your niece? Angelico nodded slowly. She had the same symptoms, the same decline. No one believed me then, but I've seen this pattern in at least 5 other children. He didn't need to say what John was already thinking. Ruth would have been next. Dr. Brant hesitated, then left to prepare the non-standard collection. John remained seated, jaw tight, fingers steepled in front of his mouth. He'd never felt this powerless, and yet somehow entirely responsible. The supplement bottle, sleek, gold-rimmed, with Laxonics branding so discreet it looked like a luxury item, sat in a sealed evidence bag on the table. We gave her poison, John said, finally, and we called it medicine. Angelico didn't speak for a moment, then, not we, you. His tone wasn't cruel, just cutting. You funded it. You authorized it. You put your signature on the distribution model that launched those supplements into homes like yours. He tapped the table once. I told you, this empire isn't clean. John stood abruptly, shoving the chair back. You think I knew? His voice cracked, fury and shame bleeding together. You think I'd knowingly give that to my daughter? Angelico met his gaze without blinking. No, but you didn't ask either, did you? That was the knife. That he hadn't asked. Hadn't questioned. Hadn't even read the compound's full dossier because the pitch deck had looked good, and the analysts were optimistic. It was an agile immune booster, pitched to early adopters and health-forward influencers. Organic-sounding names, high price tags, elegant packaging, nothing that screamed danger. Dr. Brant returned 2 hours later with preliminary results. The room felt colder than it had before. We found trace compounds in Ruth's hair and fat biopsy, he said quietly. Not common, not FDA approved. In fact, not on the market at all. He handed a printed page to John, who scanned it with trembling hands. There it was, a compound listed as LXN-103. No generic name, no classification, just 3 lines of data, all labeled pre-market. It's still in clinical trials, John whispered. Angelico stepped closer. Or supposed to be. Brant rubbed his eyes. This particular compound isn't even in phase 3. It hasn't cleared safety studies. And yet your daughter had nearly 4,000 nanograms per gram in her system. More than enough for toxicity. He swallowed hard, which means someone distributed a trial compound outside legal channels. Angelico didn't smile, but there was a grim satisfaction in his voice. Now you're catching up. He opened his coat, pulled a USB drive from his inner pocket, and slid it across the table. This is what they didn't want anyone to see. Internal memos, shipment logs, executive notes, names. John stared at it like it might explode. Where did you get this? Angelico leaned in. I've been watching Laxonics for 7 years. Ever since Sofia. They made a mistake last month, merged a private email server with a cloud-based distributor database. Someone on the inside flagged it. John inserted the drive into the tablet, password protected. But Angelico leaned over and typed in, Sofia 103. The folder opened instantly. Inside were hundreds of documents, spreadsheets, internal emails, scanned memos, redacted pages with digital watermarks that weren't redacted enough, each one more damning than the last. One memo caught John's eye. The subject line read, Luxury Integrated Deployment, Phase 1. The content detailed a quiet distribution plan using elite lifestyle partnerships to bypass FDA delays. Products positioned as wellness-enhancing supplements may begin distribution in limited markets, it read. Ideal targets, families with private physicians and concierge access. Labeling must remain ambiguous. His hands shook as he scrolled. Another email, this time from a Laxonics VP, casually noted. John Berry's firm approved Phase 1. Great cover. Their brand equity will quiet doubts. John felt the floor tilt beneath him. His name was right there. Angelico was watching him closely. "They used you," he said softly. "Your reputation, your ambition. And now they're using your daughter to measure their mistakes." John didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat closed around the shame like a noose. Dr. Brandt looked pale. This is criminal." Angelico gave a dark laugh. "No, doctor, this is capitalism in a lab coat." He turned back to John. "But now that you know, the question is, what are you going to do?" John rose slowly. The pages blurred. His own signature stared back at him from a distribution clearance form dated 3 months ago. Authorized for provisional release pending post-market surveillance. He'd signed it without blinking. The horror hit him like a tidal wave. Not only had he given his daughter the poison, he'd helped manufacture the gun that delivered it. And worse, others had too. Other children. Other families. All because he hadn't asked enough questions. His knees gave out, and he collapsed into the chair, hands cradling his face. "I did this," he whispered. "I gave them access." Angelico didn't move. He let the silence stretch. "And now," he said quietly, "you can decide whether to bury it or burn them down." The sun had just started to rise outside the hospital, casting pale orange light across the skyline. But in the dim corner of the private family conference room, there was no warmth, only war being declared in silence. Angelico stood by the window, his arms crossed, gaze fixed on the city like it owed him something. John Berry sat slumped at the table, documents spread before him, face hollow from the weight of what he now knew. The room smelled like steel and regret. "You didn't come here just for Ruth," John said, voice hoarse. Angelico didn't look away from the glass. "No," he replied. "I came because they've been getting away with this for too long. Your daughter just happened to be the moment I stopped waiting." John leaned forward, exhaustion replaced by a rising heat in his chest. "You've known about this for years, haven't you?" Angelico finally turned. "Since Sofia." He walked over and placed a black leather folder on the table. "Every page in here is another name, another child, another cover-up." John opened the folder and froze. Photographs, medical records, surveillance stills, even an email transcript between a pediatric neurologist and a laxonics compliance officer. "Bury the results. Parent consent unclear. Proceed anyway." John's hands curled into fists. Angelico sat across from him now, eyes heavy with history. "After Sofia died, I started digging. First I thought it was a freak error. Bad lot, faulty medication. But the deeper I went, the more I saw the pattern. Kids in poor neighborhoods first, then influencer families, to normalize the product." "How did no one see this?" John asked, still stunned. "People did," Angelico said. "They just got paid to look away, or threatened, or disappeared from their jobs." He tapped the folder. "I couldn't go to the press. Not with speculation. I needed proof." John glanced at a page labeled Confidential Internal Ethics Report, Laxonics Biopharma. "Where did you get all this?" Angelico met his eyes, calm and direct. "Every empire has cracks. All I did was listen. The people closest to the rot, the assistants, the accountants, the interns, they're the ones who talk when no one else does." Angelico leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking softly. "I built a network," he said. Ex-cybersecurity analysts, black hat hackers, nurses with a conscience, even 2 FDA clerks with drinking problems and access to clearance systems. I paid some. Protected others. But every file came from someone who couldn't stay silent anymore. John blinked. "You blackmailed them?" Angelico's shrug was unapologetic. "I gave them a choice. Truth or silence with consequences." His voice darkened. "That's how you fight a monster this big. Not with a press release, with leverage." John looked at him like he was seeing the man for the first time. "You're not just a gangster," Angelico chuckled without humor. "Never was just that. But it's what people needed to believe. Better to fear me than realize I've been collecting truth while they were printing lies." He tapped the USB, still plugged into the tablet. "This isn't even half of it. I have off-site storage, encrypted backups, one in Europe, one in a church basement in Newark." His gaze sharpened. "I waited for the right story, the one the world couldn't ignore." "And Ruth is that story," John said, the words falling heavy from his lips. Angelico nodded. They poisoned a billionaire's daughter. Not a nobody from Detroit. Not a waitress's kid in Georgia. Your daughter?" He paused. Now they'll listen. John ran a hand through his hair, the fight returning to his posture. "You should have told me years ago." Angelico's jaw clenched. "Claire asked me not to. Said you were too deep in your world. Said you wouldn't believe me unless you saw it yourself." The words stung, but John didn't argue. He stood and paced, processing the impossible truth. "So what now?" he asked finally. "We can't just leak this and hope for justice." Angelico nodded. "We don't hope. We hit. We pick the right target and make it loud." He pulled a phone from his coat and placed it on the table. The screen lit up with a name, Amira DeLaro, investigative journalist. She's not mainstream, doesn't work for the networks, but she's broken 2 major whistleblower stories in the last 5 years. And she doesn't scare easy. John looked at the name, hesitating. "How do you know she'll take it?" Angelico smiled faintly. "Because she's been waiting for it. I fed her small leads for months. She knows something big is coming. She just doesn't know who's bringing it." "Then, let's bring it," John said. "All of it." He opened the folder again and stared at the faces. Sofia, Darius, a girl named Reina whose parents were both undocumented, the perfect target. They used me to make this thing respectable. I'm going to use my name to burn it down. Angelico met his gaze, and for once there was no animosity between them, just shared fury. "You sure you're ready?" he asked. "Because once this goes public, your hands are dirty too. You'll go from grieving father to corporate traitor overnight." John didn't flinch. "Let them come." He picked up the phone and tapped the contact. It rang once, twice. Then a female voice answered. "DeLaro." John said, "You don't know me, but I've got something you've been waiting for." They met that night in a dimly lit hotel bar off Fifth Avenue. Amira DeLaro was younger than John expected, but her eyes were seasoned with war. She scanned the folder in silence for nearly an hour, then looked up, pale and furious. "This is a class action lawsuit waiting to explode," John nodded. "And I want to be the one who lights the fuse." She agreed to publish the first expose in 72 hours. They would release redacted versions of the most damning documents, starting with Sofia's case and Ruth's toxicology report. Angelico would feed encrypted copies of the rest through offshore servers. John's PR team, what remained of them, would be kept in the dark until launch. "This will cost you everything," Amira warned. "Your board seat, your investments, maybe your name." John looked at her and then at Angelico. "Let it." He turned to the screen, watching the files upload. "They killed children. I'll survive the headlines." At 3:14 a.m., the final file finished transferring. Angelico stood, buttoned his coat, and extended a hand. John took it. No hesitation. "Just purpose." "We go to war," Angelico said quietly. "One family at a time." The first thing Ruth did was blink. Not the weak, flickering kind she'd managed during seizures, but a full, slow, deliberate blink that made the nurse gasp. Her chest lifted stronger than it had in days. The machines didn't panic. For the first time in over a week, they followed her lead. John had fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed, head resting against the IV pole. When the nurse touched his shoulder and whispered, "She's awake," he nearly knocked the monitor over, getting to his feet. Ruth's eyes were open now, unfocused but aware. Pale green, rimmed with fatigue, but real. "Ruthie," he breathed, grabbing her hand. She squeezed back. Tears slid down his face without apology. "Can you talk?" he asked. Her lips moved, cracked and dry. The nurse offered a sponge. Ruth licked it, then whispered hoarsely, "There was a girl." John froze. "A what?" "A girl," Ruth said again. "In the dark. She touched my hand. Said her name was Sofia." The room went still. The nurse's pen slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. John looked toward the doorway. Angelico stood there, unmoving. His hands gripped the frame, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Ruth's voice came again, soft and certain. She said she was waiting for him to listen. Angelico didn't say a word. He He turned and walked down the hallway, slow and uneven. Once around the corner, he sank to the floor against the wall. No theatrics, no sound. Just a man breaking where no one could see. He had lost Sofia, and yet somehow, in the strangest, cruelest way, she'd spoken again. Through Ruth. Through that moment. Through the space between life and whatever waits just beyond it. Angelico buried his face in his hands and let the weight finally collapse. By morning, the world was already catching fire. Amira's story broke faster than they could brace for. Billionaire's daughter survives experimental poisoning, leaked files reveal corporate cover-up. The article hit 4 million views in 8 hours. Major outlets picked it up within the day, followed by round-the-clock commentary, talking heads, and medical experts fumbling for distance. Laxonics issued a press release by sunset. Their official statement was cold and sterile. A rogue research partner acted independently of corporate oversight. The phrase isolated incident was used 17 times. They offered condolences. They promised swift internal review. But the documents told another story. Emails. Shipment logs. Unapproved human trials. Partnerships with shell companies overseas. Sofia's name buried in testing protocols dated a year before Ruth was born. The internet didn't buy the spin. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag Sofia screamed. Hashtag justice for Ruth. Hashtag poison in plain sight. Overnight, Angelico James, once whispered about in fear, became a strange sort of hero. But heroes don't wait for applause. Angelico was already moving. From a safe house in Queens, he coordinated data drops across 2 continents. One encrypted drive was delivered to a whistleblower agency in Geneva. Another went straight to an Italian watchdog group, long rumored to have ties to the Vatican. A third, his most dangerous, was sent directly to a judge overseeing pharmaceutical lobbying cases in Boston. John tried to warn him. "You're gonna make them desperate," he said over the phone. Angelico only replied, "They were already desperate. Now they're exposed." His voice was steel. On Thursday morning, federal agents in Boston raided Laxonics' East Coast research facility. By dusk, Italian officials had stormed their European lab in Milan. 27 staff were detained. 3 executives were placed on international watch lists. The mask had been ripped away. CNN broke the raid with the headline, "Global Investigations Open into Laxonics Following Ruth Berry Case." Meanwhile, Amira published a second exposé titled, "Corporate Murder Disguised as Innovation." The article led with Sofia's photo. Inside the hospital, Ruth was moved out of ICU. She could sit up now, eat small meals, respond to questions with faint nods or tired smiles. The doctors still didn't understand how she'd survived. Not medically, not with the levels of contamination she carried, but they watched in awe as she got stronger. John sat beside her each day, holding her hand while the world outside devoured the scandal. He kept a single photo in his pocket now, one of Claire holding newborn Ruth. She would have been proud, he thought, maybe heartbroken, but proud. Angelico came only once more to the hospital. Quiet, unnoticed. He slipped into Ruth's room while she was asleep. He placed a folded drawing, a sketch of a little girl in a sundress, holding hands with another girl made of stars, on the nightstand. At the bottom he'd written, "She waited for you." He turned to leave, but the second he stepped into the hallway, 2 men in suits closed in. No badges, no warning. Just cuffs, cold and fast. One whispered, "He made too much noise, James." John got the call an hour later. "They've arrested him," Amira said, breathless. "Not on the raids, not on the data leaks. They're going after old charges. RICO, obstruction, conspiracy, sealed warrants. They've been sitting on them for years." John hung up without a word. Ruth was asleep again, her heart monitor soft and steady. He stood at the window, watching the rain start to fall across the city. Angelico had saved his daughter, exposed a crime no one wanted to see. And now he was being erased by the very system he'd forced to open its eyes. Justice, it seemed, didn't always wear a badge. Do you think Angelico did the right thing, even if it meant breaking the law? Let us know in the comments. Would you have done what he did to protect a child? The storm hit the city the same morning Angelico James was transferred to holding. John Berry watched the rain streak down his car window, each drop distorting the skyline he once believed was unshakable. For a man who had built empires out of code, algorithms, and systems, he had never felt more powerless. Money couldn't buy what he needed now, justice that wasn't for sale. But he wasn't going to stop until Angelico was free. He spent the next 48 hours calling in every favor that power had ever earned him. Senators, attorneys, journalists, anyone with influence or reach. Half of them hung up the moment they heard Angelico's name. The other half agreed to look into it, their voices trembling under the weight of corporate pressure. It didn't matter. John wasn't asking anymore, he was demanding. Meanwhile, the story refused to die. Public outrage grew louder by the hour, forcing agencies to acknowledge what Laxonics had done. Class action filings poured in, hundreds of families, thousands of signatures, every one of them carrying a story of loss or near miss. Amira DeLaro's articles became evidence in federal investigations, and in the background of every headline was a photo of a man in handcuffs who had saved a child the law could not. Ruth was recovering faster than anyone predicted. Her color had returned, her eyes bright, her smile small but real. Doctors whispered words like miracle and unprecedented recovery without understanding how it happened. When asked, John would only say, quote, "She was healed by a man who never went to medical school." And somehow, that shut everyone up. 2 weeks later, the first hearing was set. Angelico's charges read like a novel: RICO violations, conspiracy, data theft, obstruction of justice. They called him a criminal mastermind, a manipulator of networks, a vigilante with a god complex. But the courtroom wasn't filled with fear. It was filled with parents, ordinary people, holding photos of the children he'd helped save. When they brought Angelico in, he didn't look like the monster they'd painted. He looked tired, older somehow, like the fight had taken pieces of him. He'd never get back. But his eyes were clear, sharp, unflinching, unafraid. He met John's gaze briefly as he sat, a faint nod of acknowledgement between them. No words, no gestures, just understanding. John's legal team had spent days building a counteroffensive. They presented Ruth's medical records, the Laxonics internal memos, the testimony of 3 whistleblowers, and the FDA's formal acknowledgement of unregulated drug testing. It was enough to stall the prosecution's narrative, but not erase it. Angelico had broken laws, yes, but he'd done it to expose bigger ones. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and calm authority, listened carefully. When the argument settled and the courtroom quieted, she asked the one question everyone was waiting for. "Mr. James," she said, "you've been accused of hacking, bribery, and illegal surveillance. You claim your motives were noble. So tell this court, why did you help them?" The room held its breath. Angelico's answer came slowly, almost softly. "Because someone once helped me," he said. He paused, eyes glancing toward John, then to the crowd of parents clutching framed photographs. "And because I remember the name of every child they didn't." No one spoke after that. Not the prosecutor, not the journalist scribbling notes, not even the judge who simply nodded once and called for recess. It was the kind of moment that didn't need applause. It needed silence to understand its weight. Outside, reporters swarmed John for statements. He ignored them all. He only said one thing before stepping into the car. "There's a price for healing. Sometimes it's not paid in money, but in years, blood, and truth." The cameras caught it. The world repeated it. Over the next few weeks, pressure mounted against Laxonics executives. Share prices collapsed. 3 senior board members were indicted. Global health agencies began re-examining luxury trial programs used to test compounds on unknowing patients. What started as one girl's coma had become an international reckoning. John visited Angelico in detention the following Friday. The man was seated at a steel table, the fluorescent light above them flickering weakly. John slid an envelope across the surface. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a legal document. Angelico glanced at it, then raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "It's the paperwork for a foundation," John said. "Funded by my estate, run independently, dedicated to medical ethics and healing access." Angelico didn't touch it. John continued, voice low. "It'll carry your name. The Angelico James Institute for Justice and Healing." He looked at him squarely. "For Sofia, for Ruth, for everyone." Angelico leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "You don't owe me that," he said quietly. John shook his head. "You don't understand. This isn't repayment. It's preservation. People forget stories, but institutions, they last. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The hum of the light above them filled the silence. Finally, Angelico reached for the pen lying near the document. He signed the bottom of the page in his sharp, deliberate handwriting. Then, let's make sure they never forget. John stood to leave, but Angelico stopped him with a single sentence. When you walk out there, tell them I don't need to be free to keep fighting. John turned, brow furrowed. What does that mean? Angelico smiled faintly. Justice doesn't always wear a badge, remember? Then he nodded toward the door. Go, you've got a world to wake up. That night, as John stepped outside into the cool wind, the city lights looked different. They weren't just bright. They were alive, pulsing with possibility and consequence. The lawsuits, the hearings, the media circus, none of it would undo what had been lost. But for the first time in years, John felt like something good had come from his mistakes. The empire had fallen, but something purer had risen from its ashes. 6 months passed like a lifetime. New York shed its winter and bloomed into spring, but it wasn't the seasons that had changed. It was everything else. The news cycle had quieted, but its echoes still rippled through the medical world. Laxonics was no longer a name whispered behind closed doors. It was now a cautionary tale taught in ethics classes. Legislation had been introduced to reform drug trials, expand informed consent laws, and enforce greater transparency for integrated wellness products. But the most important change wasn't on paper. It was standing in a sunlit courtyard, laughing. Ruth Berry was healthy. Stronger than before, taller too, with eyes that didn't dart away when people looked at her. She wore a pale yellow dress and held a bouquet of white flowers, her hands steady. No machines followed her now. No monitors. Just her, whole and alive. The crowd gathered beneath a banner that rippled in the breeze. The Angelico James Institute for Ethical Healing. An elegant building stood behind them, glass and stone, humble but striking. It wasn't a hospital, it wasn't a clinic, it was something new. Inside, the walls bore photographs of children once forgotten. Sofia, Reina, Darius. Ruth's face joined them. Not in mourning, but in hope. Every hallway blended old-world remedies with modern medical innovation. At the center hung a single quote in etched brass. What's ancient isn't obsolete. It's just waiting to be understood. John stood at the podium, dressed in a dark suit, but his posture was looser now. A man no longer running from guilt. The press was here, of course, but so were the parents. The children. The quiet survivors. I used to think healing came from the top down, John began, his voice clear over the microphone. I thought it lived in machines, in titles, in prestige. He looked toward the front row, where Ruth sat beside Amira and 2 nurses from the ICU. But I was wrong. Healing comes from truth, and sometimes from the places we're taught to fear. There was a moment of stillness. Then a ripple of applause. John stepped back. He gestured toward the next speaker. Ruth. She stood, nerves evident but unshaken. She approached the microphone, gripping a small piece of paper, but after glancing down once, she folded it up and put it away. I was asleep, she said, voice soft but certain. I don't remember everything. But I remember this. I remember a girl with stars in her hair. She held my hand and said her name was Sofia. She told me someone was coming, someone who knew what the doctors didn't. Someone who had already lost and wasn't going to let it happen again. Ruth turned toward the front row. Angelico sat between 2 federal monitors, still technically under supervised release. But the crowd didn't see a criminal. They saw a man who had changed the course of hundreds of lives. A man who refused to look away when it would have been easier, safer, to stay silent. He saved my life, Ruth said, her voice stronger now. And he never asked for anything. The words landed like truth often does. Simple, clear, undeniable. The applause this time didn't ripple. It roared. Angelico stood slowly. He approached the podium without ceremony, adjusting his collar like he'd rather be anywhere else. But his eyes, always still, always sharp, held more softness than anyone had seen in them before. He didn't look at the cameras, he looked at Ruth. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever, he said. Your voice reminded the world that justice doesn't only come in courtrooms. He turned to face the crowd, hands folded before him. I've been called a lot of things, but the truth is simple. You don't need a badge to do good, just a reason, and a promise you won't break. He stepped back, and the crowd rose to their feet. Later that day, after the ribbon was cut and the press had dispersed, Angelico found a quiet bench in the garden courtyard. Ruth joined him, curling up beside him without a word. They sat like that for a long time, no words needed. In the center of the courtyard bloomed a single rosemary bush, planted in Sicilian soil flown in especially for the opening. It was Sofia's. John watched them from a distance, hand in pocket, letter from Claire still folded neatly beside his wallet. Healing, he realized, had never been about fixing what was broken. It was about remembering what was sacred, what was worth protecting, and who was brave enough to do it, even if the world never said thank you. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.